Okay, it looks like we're live, so I'll get us started. Thank you for attending the late breaking plenary on the international implications of the US election, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We are excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a small or large, if you'd like, donation today. We will post links with details in the chat. A few logistical things to consider before we start the webinar. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by the AHA's Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions for the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but need to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be part of the conversation on social media, please use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the AHA's YouTube channel after this session. I will now turn things over to our chair, John McNeill of Georgetown University. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. And we'll get underway now. I will very briefly introduce our panel in the order in which they're going to speak. Each will speak for roughly 6 to 10 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. And as Debbie just said, register your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So the first speaker will be Beverly Gage from Yale University. She will be followed by Paul Krugman from NYU, who in turn will be followed by Minian from Stanford University. And if they've all been succinct and kept to the time schedule, then I will speak for a few minutes myself at the end, and then we'll have the Q&A. So with that, let's get underway. Beverly, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the AHA for organizing this. There are, of course, many things to be talking about in terms of breaking news and historical parallels, and whether we're living in a moment that has any historical parallels. But since the purpose of this particular panel is to think through the international implications of this transitional moment that we're in, I thought that I would start by talking just briefly about US foreign policy, a little bit about what we can tell at this point about the directions that the Biden administration might be moving in based on some of the preliminary appointments that have already started to come through. And then in particular, to just pose some questions and debates, since we are a community of historians, where I think it really would be useful for historians to weigh in. I think as a scholar who is thinking about these kinds of questions, one of the pieces that's always a little bit alarming, but particularly I think of concern in the foreign policy space, is the real division between the conversations that are happening in Washington, the conversations that are happening among policymakers, and the conversations that are happening within the academy. And so I always think it's useful to think through places that we might bring some of our scholarship, and that in fact many people within the AHA and within the historical community already are bringing scholarship to bear on really important issues. So in this transitional moment, we are coming out of an administration that I think it is safe to say set out to break a lot of the basic structures and tenets of American foreign policy as it's operated for at least the past few decades. Some of that under Trump has been a kind of institutional assault on the administrative state more generally, but I think particularly on institutions like the State Department, the intelligence community, that are so critical to the ways that foreign policy has been conducted, not filling positions, attacking the legitimacy of the forms of expertise that really make those institutions run. We've seen attacks on the kind of basic alliance system that the United States has been involved in. Of course, we've seen Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. We have seen him pulling out of the climate accord. We've seen a shift in the US stance toward China. And perhaps most importantly, I think we have seen the ways in which the erosion of and attacks on democratic institutions at home really are going to have pretty profound effects on what it is that the United States can do, can champion, can talk about, can think about in its relations with the rest of the world. So we are at a moment in which, as I said, I think a lot of that has been kind of broken and collapsed, at least rhetorically, some of it actually as well. And so that means that the Biden administration, far more than other administrations, I think in the past, has the work of rebuilding to do. And so coming in at a moment like this, it seems like there are three options on the table. One is to proceed with things as they are. That's unlikely to happen. Another would be to kind of set an agenda that is really about restoration, kind of erasing, undoing what was done during the Trump years and returning to the status quo ante, looking back to the teens, to the 2000s. And then the third possibility would be to take this as a kind of moment of creative destruction and therefore creative rethinking, where some of the basic premises of American foreign policy might be rethought, and in which some of the institutional structures in which that has been conducted might also be rebuilt. I think thus far we can pretty safely say that the Biden administration seems to be choosing option number two, which is to say that most of the appointments that have come through at this point really are attempts to return to the Obama administration. They're folks who have come straight out of the Obama administration. And while there's been, some level of discussion and rethinking, I think the impulse is to kind of go back to some of the structures and ideas and forms of expertise that were operative then. This is, of course, not altogether a bad thing, given that a lot of what's happened over the last several years has been really pushing very qualified, experienced people out of public service, out of government service, making the powerful claim that there's no place for that. But I also think that this is something of a missed opportunity to rethink how these institutions ought to operate, what some of the first principles of American foreign policy ought to be. And I would say in particular, who ought to be included in those kinds of conversations. I think we still see a relatively small, relatively closed circle of people talking with each other about the direction of American foreign policy going forward. So all of that said, I think there are some really interesting debates that are underway where historians can and are already playing a pretty important role in thinking about what the future ought to look like. And I'm just going to list a few of those real quickly before we turn it over to the next panelist, because in foreign policy, as elsewhere, I think a lot of the ways that decisions are made are based on not only past example, but our narratives of the past. And of course, that's what historians do. So one of those is a debate about the future of the so-called liberal international order. This is a debate that is underway in passionate form about what the fate of these institutions created in the 1940s during and in the wake of World War II ought to be: NATO alliance, the United Nations, some of the international economic institutions set up in that moment. Should the goal be to preserve them, to move forward with them? Or should this be a moment of rethinking and potentially even dismantling some of those? That seems like a key place that historians' voices can really matter. Another debate that I think is going to be really crucial over the next few years is the debate about China and whether or not we are in a new Cold War, right? This Cold War metaphor is coming up more and more, and different people seem to mean different things by that. So for some people, I think it indicates that we're in an era where we're supposed to be returning to great power politics, to struggles between nations, and that concerns like terrorism, regional stability, smaller powers, those are taking a back seat to this kind of emerging grand struggle. I think for other people, it suggests that, you know, the language of the Cold War was often useful in getting domestic reforms that you might want. So particularly around science or education, will this be a useful metaphor? But again, historians have a key role to play in really weighing in on what was the Cold War, how do we understand it, and how we ought to be thinking about it in the present. I'll mention two more, one where I think there's a very active debate underway and one where I think we could really be doing better. The one where there's a passionate debate underway, I think, is about the lessons of the 1990s, about the post-Cold War moment, which I think for this generation of policymakers is in many ways their formative political experience, mostly people who came of age in the 90s and early 2000s, in that moment of kind of post-Cold War triumphalism. And again, are we supposed to be kind of returning to, recapturing some sort of bold American leadership from that era, or were there a series of decisions made that were really quite disastrous or quite mistaken during that period? And the place that I would like to see a lot more robust conversation happening that I don't think we're quite there yet is around the period post 9/11, but particularly around the Iraq War. It seems to me that if that's going to be one of our touchstones for thinking about how to move forward, there's some kind of dangerous historical thinking settling in around a narrative of American innocence, around a narrative that suggests that the United States couldn't possibly have known in advance how disastrous that war was going to turn out to be. And I think historians, and if there are any graduate students out there, you know, we're going to be starting to write the histories of the 1990s and the 2000s. I think really producing more critical histories of the Iraq War will be important in sort of guiding questions of the future. So I will leave it there in terms of introductory remarks. This was as much focused on the past as the future, even though we're supposed to be talking about implications. But I guess my point is that those historical narratives really do matter, and that they have pretty profound implications for whether this is going to be a moment for rethinking the directions of American foreign policy or for basically returning to the past.
Thank you, Beverly. You brought it in just under 10 minutes. Paul Krugman is next.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, John. I do need to say that I am not at NYU, which is a lavishly funded private university. I am at the City University of New York, which is a bare bones, hand-to-mouth public university. We're kind of sensitive about that.
My apologies.
But okay, so I'm going to talk really about a very specialized piece of foreign policy, because first of all, because I don't fancy myself an expert on the broader field, and secondly, because it's my home turf, and it's one of the areas where I think there's going to be a profound change, even though we're changing management, which is trade policy. And what I think what you need to appreciate, I think, in the first place, is that the global trading system, which is basically the U.S. created it and has played a crucial role in sustaining it, and it's a remarkable thing. There's really nothing else like it in international relations. It is a global system of rules. It's it's ruled by law, not by nation states, although obviously they play a big role in it. And it works, or it has worked until now, until very recently. We actually had a system of rules by which the major players, in fact, by and large, abided. And it's a remarkable thing. It was always intended to be not just uh, about economics, but also to have kind of meta implications. If you really want to go back to the origins, you want to go back to Cordell Hull and the belief that fostering free trade would also lead to would also help to sustain peace. So there was always a, ulterior motives as well as purely economic motives. Um, it was a system. Well, now obviously one of the core interests of Donald Trump was in taking us away from that system, breaking down the rules, going away from free trade towards protectionism, and just in general going away from having the United States constrained by rules. The interesting thing about that is that on the one hand, of all of the things that Trump did, I think this probably had the least real constituency behind it. When all was said and done and all of the talk about rebellion against globalization and all of that, there was never any indication that there was a large popular base behind Trump's tariffs. It just wasn't, if anything, public opinion moved very strongly in favor of trade over the course of the Trump years. And there certainly were, there were very narrow interest groups that had some interest in it, but by and large, business interests were horrified. They hated the Trump trade wars. So it was not something that had a large base. This was really just one guy wanted it. The guy happening to be the president of the United States. And he was able to do that because the way we have the genius of trade policy up until it turned into a disaster was that we had a system of rules, but the system required some flexibility, some ability to constrain, to deal with surges of imports, events, so that we gave a lot of discretion to the executive branch. Essentially, it turns out, almost infinite discretion to the president, which was based on the belief that special interests would buy Congress people, but the White House would take a broader view of affairs, which worked until it didn't. So that Trump was able to make a drastic break with policy without ever having to pass legislation. He was just able to exploit the rules, exploit the Section 232, Section 201, Section 301 to engage in trade wars. So you would think, okay, since this had not much of a constituency, it was just one guy, it would be very easily reversible. But in fact, it won't be. In fact, you'll never be able to put this thing back together the way it was. It's a real Humpty Dumpty situation for two reasons. The narrow one is that by engaging in these trade wars and by making those trade wars a political issue, the Trump administration created facts. I mean, there was a constant campaign refrain that Joe Biden is in the pocket of China. And although it didn't actually get very much traction, nonetheless, it means that even if a Biden administration felt that the whole trade war with China was a mistake, it's going to be in no rush to unwind it. I don't think it's really something you want to do. And then the other thing to say, so that's one point. It's very hard for Biden to reverse this. The other is that the credibility of the system will never be back to where it was. The fact that the United States, which has always been the benevolent hegemon of the system, although we've kind of been a co-hegemon along with the European Union in recent years, the fact that the United States can abruptly just say, okay, we're going to exploit loopholes in the rules to completely abrogate our previous agreements means that no one will ever have the same faith in the world trading system that they had before. And so that means that we're just in a very, very different world now. I don't think, I presume that the Biden people will try to reconstitute the international trading order, but they're going to have a very hard time restoring it to anything like where it was. I mean, if you think about where Obama was at the end, trying to negotiate unsuccessfully, but TPP and all of that, that's not going to be something that's going to be realistically a possibility. In fact, it's going to be hard to even avoid countries from doing what we ourselves did over the past 4 years, which is, at a political whim, engaging in major trade interventions. So it's one of those areas where I think it's going to be very hard for Biden to reverse the effects of the Trump years. I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Very succinct. Minian is next.
In this introductory remark, I will speak about the implications of the election on questions of migration, which of course are inherently international. Trump launched himself to the presidency using very dramatic anti-immigrant rhetoric, and then went on to propel anti-immigrant laws and policies that were meant to make life harder for those undocumented migrants who already lived in the United States, while also reducing the number of migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers who were entering the country. Biden has promised to reverse many of Trump's most controversial policies. As such, it is undeniable that Biden's policies will be better for immigrants. But as an immigration historian, it is also clear to me that in many matters of migration, the difference between Trump's policies and Biden's policies is simply one of degree rather than a true change. After all, Biden is not in any way seeking to alter the long-standing structures of immigration enforcement that are both extremely inhumane and ineffective. Let me give you a couple of examples to illuminate this. First, let's look at Biden's immigration framework. During his campaign, Biden promised to defend DACA and even to fight for a path for citizenship for undocumented immigrants. This is, of course, the exact opposite of what Donald Trump demanded. If it happened, it would be a huge victory for undocumented immigrants. And I in no way want to diminish the importance that this triumph would signify for them. But if we look closely at Biden's immigration plan, we see that it introduces legalization and a path to citizenship paired along with increases in border enforcement that are meant to prevent further immigration. This framework of exchanging legalization for enhanced border enforcement that Biden is proposing resembles very closely to the one that Congress introduced in the last comprehensive immigration reform bill of 1986, which is known as the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or even better known as IRCA. This act called for the legalization of undocumented immigrants who had been in the country, residing in the country for over 5 years. And it also called for increases in border fortification. Now, before IRCA passed, in other words, before 1986, most of those who entered the United States without papers were Mexican men who engaged in circular migration. They would leave Mexico, come to the United States, reside here for short periods of time, return to Mexico, and then start the process all over again. But after IRCA came about and crossing the border became much harder, many Mexican men decided to no longer engage in this circular migration. Instead, they encouraged their families to cross the border once and settle with them permanently in the United States. They no longer dared to engage in this circular migration because they feared that if they went back to Mexico, they would not be able to cross the border back north. Needless to say, the fortification of the border dramatically increased the number of undocumented migrants living in the United States. After all, This migration went from being a circular phenomenon to being a permanent one. And it went from being a male endeavor to being a family endeavor. And let me add that border fortification, of course, also increased the number of deaths and the violence that we see at the border, as migrants had to increasingly cross through harder terrains and to rely on professional smugglers. Let me give you another example to examine Biden's policies, and that is immigration detention. One of Trump's key policies was the zero tolerance policy, by which children were separated from their parents while in detention. Biden has condemned this policy, and it is very unlikely that he would introduce anything like it during his presidency. But Biden has never addressed the broader issue of eliminating the system of detaining migrants as a whole, even though this was something that the United States implemented successfully between 1954 and 1980. In fact, in 1958, the Supreme Court held, and I quote, "Physical detention of aliens is now the exception, not the rule." And it added, "Certainly, this policy reflects the humane qualities of an enlightened civilization." Let's be clear, immigration detention is inhumane beyond the separation of children from their parents. And as if that was not enough, it is also costly. In 2019 alone, we spent $3.1 billion in our colossal immigration system. And equally important, detention also continues to be unnecessary. Community-based release programs have shown to be highly effective at ensuring that migrants appear in court. Let me turn to one final point that sheds light on Biden's policies. During his campaign, Biden promised to end the Remain in Mexico policy, by which asylum seekers must wait in Mexico while their cases are being adjudicated. This, I have to say, is extremely important because in Mexico, asylum seekers are currently facing dire consequences. Life in Mexico is very hard, and they face a lot of violence while waiting. But I have to add, in no way is Biden considering the deeper issue, and that would be ceasing the long-term practice of offshoring immigration enforcement to Mexico. In the 1980s, the United States persuaded Mexican authorities to enter into a type of Faustian bargain with them, by which US policymakers told the Mexican authorities that if Mexico managed to curtail the number of Central Americans that entered Mexico and went through it and eventually reached the US-Mexico border, if Mexico managed to do that, US policymakers said, then the US government might turn a blind eye to Mexican unauthorized migration. As a result, since the 1980s, Mexico has regularly deported more Central Americans who are trying to reach the United States than the United States itself. And I have to say that this practice is also extremely violent. In Mexico, Central Americans, trans migrants are regularly robbed, extorted, sexually abused, and even murdered. And this happens both at the hands of citizens and of Mexican state officials. But now that I have made this argument, I want to add one important addendum. And that is that I think that under a Biden administration, I do believe that there might be hope for real change when it comes to immigration. But it is likely that this change will not come under the hands of the Biden administration, but more likely by the actions of activists and lawyers. Under the Trump administration, organizers were unable to fight for a more humane immigration system because they had to fight against the incessant anti-immigrant policies that Trump kept introducing. In contrast, the Biden administration will likely give them the space to fight not against new draconian policies, but in favor of more humane ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, I will now make a few remarks. We have at the moment a handful of questions in the Q&A. Feel free to add to that roster, which we will turn to as soon as I've finished. My remarks fall into two categories. First set will be about public health. The second set about the environment. And in both cases, I'll be doing what historians should never do, which is make some predictions. But these are based on my reading of the past. Firstly, with respect to public health, it's going to be no surprise that the United States will return to the World Health Organization and will boost its level of international cooperation in public health matters. That should be comparatively easy. In a slightly longer time frame, I think that the US is going to play an active role under a Biden administration in improving pandemic preparedness on the global level, on the national level, and indeed on every level. And that pandemic preparedness is going to improve markedly over the next 5 years or so. But then I further predict, getting into quicksand here, that exalted level of pandemic preparedness will erode, first slowly, and then if no bad pandemics afflict us, more rapidly. Just like the erosions of prior vaccination regimes, mosquito control regimes, and so forth. What we might call our cognitive immune system, or maybe our cognitive PPE, will decay, precisely because of success. Nobody wants to pay to deal with a problem that they don't see. So I am now done with public health. I'm going to move on to the environment, and particularly the most important piece of the environment, climate change. And I'm going to try to share my screen with you. Okay, I hope that you're seeing a historical graph of global CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. So the Biden administration is going to be under a lot of pressure from its supporters to reduce emissions and to hasten the transition to a renewable energy regime. It's not going to be all that easy to do the latter. Energy transitions always take a long time, decades. And in the short run, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is crucial to the Democratic majority or Democratic control of the Senate. And he is not much interested in transitioning away from the fossil fuel regime. Looking at this, I want to impress upon you one thing, which is that major historical events don't matter much in terms of the chemical history of the atmosphere. Some people think, and if you can see my cursor here, you see I'm pointing to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people think that an opportunity exists here to change the trajectory of CO2 emissions on a global scale. Probably we're down about 7% in 2020 over 2019, which is great, but it's, I think, likely to conform to the pattern that you see here that is likely to be a blip and not a trend. Indeed, in China, the emissions were down early in 2020 and have rebounded in the latter half of 2020. So let's see if I can move to a second slide here. Okay, so rejoining the Paris Accords is high on the Biden agenda. I think as a practical matter, it's not going to be all that difficult to do. Meeting the targets of the Paris Accord, particularly the 2025 targets, is going to be tough, partly because of the last 4 years. I'm not sure that we should really expect the 2025 targets, which means lowering emissions by approximately a quarter below their 2005 level. I'm not sure we should expect that actually to happen, despite Biden's interest in it and the pressure he's going to be under to achieve it. Longer term targets under the Paris Accords for 2030 and 2050 might actually, even though they demand more in terms of cuts and at a steeper rate, they might be a little easier to achieve. And that will depend, as far as the United States is concerned, on how many climate deniers the US elects to high office in future. So right now, as you can see, looking at this slide, the US is not all that far off its international targets. It's doing a little better because of the pandemic than otherwise would be, but 2019 was a bad year in which emissions actually climbed. Next, I want to talk a little bit, this will be my last point, about the international politics of climate. So the biggest decisions are going to be made in Beijing. As you can see from this slide, which breaks out the annual carbon emissions to the atmosphere by world region over the last 100 or more years, you can see that lately China has emerged as the most important player in carbon emissions and therefore in climate politics. Right now, China accounts for about 29% of CO2 emissions. The US accounts for about 17%. So what I think is the key variable in making the Paris Accords and subsequent agreements, there's supposed to be another gathering in Glasgow next year to hammer out some more agreements. The most important variable, I think, is US-China relations, which are now at a fairly low ebb. It's important, I think, that they not be so low as to forbid cooperation, both on the public health front and on the climate front. So this brings us back to international relations and Beverly Gage's opening. So I will leave it there and let us turn to the Q&A. Now, right now we have quite a roster of questions, so we probably won't be able to get to them all, but let's begin with one that's rather philosophical. William Schmidt asks, is President Trump our first postmodern president? Does anybody wish to hazard an answer to that?
I'll take a crack at that. I think possibly the answer is yes, but I guess what that question spurs for me is thinking about questions of truth, of expertise, of kind of institutional authority, which are now at such a low ebb. I think if you look at what happened on January 6th, and look at the sorts of things that the people who showed up and ransacked the Capitol were saying, a lot of that was about this kind of elite rage, right? And I think it is actually one of these things that unites a lot of the issues that we're talking about here, that suspicion of a kind of elite and expert produced truth, right? It's an issue in climate change. It's an issue in public health. Frankly, it's going to be a major issue for higher education going onward. So I don't know if he's our first postmodern president in the way that the questioner wanted us to say, because that's a pretty broad question, but that's what it evokes for me. And I think it's something particularly that institutions of higher education really need to think about as a political problem going forward, and not something that can be set aside. Even though Trump's gone, those strains are going to stick around.
Soon to be gone.
Soon, in theory.
So the next question is directed specifically at Professor Krugman from Howard Spendelow, who asks, given what you said about the likelihood of Biden not immediately reversing Trump's trade war with China, can you suggest an appropriate and effective pace for doing so? With what steps might such a reversal begin? What pitfalls should be avoided?
Okay, I don't have any pipeline to what the incoming Biden team is actually thinking, but I know if I were in their position, I suspect that they're probably thinking along the same lines. What they need to do is they need to frame things as we are getting tough on China, but we're doing it in a smart way. So now I think the non-China pieces of Trump policy can be have been largely unwound anyway, but they've been what remains. So we can end the trade conflict with the Europeans. We can end trade conflict imposing tariffs on Canadian steel on national security grounds. That sort of thing can be done away with. But on China, it has to be framed as a smart, getting tough in a smart way, which means, I think, trying to bring in other players, means trying to bring in particularly Europeans on and putting some kind of pressure on the Chinese. And it means trying to refocus it on things that make some sense. Chinese industrial policy, intellectual property, not the bilateral trade balance. But I don't think it's going to be easy to just plain remove the tariffs until you can point to something else that has been achieved. Now, it might be largely symbolic. I mean, to a certain extent, I think if the Biden administration might aim several years from now to have basically gone back to pre-Trump tariff rates on China, but under a framework which claims that even though the numbers look the same, the situation is actually very different. Kind of do what Trump did with NAFTA, replace it with almost the same agreement but with a changed name. But I think also you need some real stuff there. So the aim will be to form a multilateral coalition to get at least some kind of concessions. But it's a very tough road. I mean, but you cannot simply say, okay, we're going to reset everything. We're going to pretend that 2017 through 2020 didn't happen, and you're going to have to show something, which means that an important part is going to be outreach. I think that the only way this works is if other players, and above all the EU, somehow can be seen as helping the United States in its tougher sounding, at least, posture.
Great, thank you. So the next question, Tim Palese posted before I began to talk about public health, but he asks, will the election have effects on virus response internationally? If so, how? I would say not much. As I said, I think it's going to have a lot of effect on pandemic preparedness in the future. But with respect to virus response, I think the Biden administration is going to prioritize and be under tremendous pressure to prioritize the domestic front. There'll be behind the scenes cooperation, information sharing, et cetera, perhaps ramped up a little bit, but I don't think it's going to make all that much difference in virus response in the short term.
John, could I add something to that? Oh, sorry if you're not done.
Yeah. Go ahead, ask something.
So I actually think that if we look at the AIDS epidemic, we could see a couple of things that might be different and some that might be the same. So the first that we see that when AIDS first started, HIV first started, it was characterized as a disease that only affected gay people, and then it became extremely stigmatized. And when it comes to disease, we see that Trump has done the exact same thing, even calling it the Chinese virus. So I think one of the things that Biden will be more careful doing is not linking a virus, a disease, to stigmatize people. Another thing that we can see if we compare the AIDS epidemic to the current coronavirus epidemic is the importance of science. President Reagan never spent money when it came to funding research for AIDS. And we have seen that Trump has done the same. He has, like you said, he took away the early program designed to avert potential pandemics. And like you well said, I think that this is going to be a difference for future pandemics. And the one thing where I do believe the AIDS epidemic relates to how things might remain the same and between Biden and Trump would be in the global distribution of medicine. The AIDS epidemic showed how in the United States and richer countries, people began to have access to medicine at the start of the millennium, while sub-Saharan Africa did not. And I fear that, especially with the vaccine distribution will not take place. You know, both Biden and Trump have asserted that the vaccine will first be distributed in the United States. So why should I, a very healthy 37-year-old, get a vaccine before someone who is more at risk elsewhere? With AIDS, we saw that sub-Saharan Africa did not get the medicines needed. Now we're seeing that lower income countries are not going to get the vaccine they need, and at least not as quickly. And this will, of course, propel the economic differences between those countries that will continue to propel health disparities as well.
Lower income countries will get Sinovac, which is apparently between 78 and 90% effective and a whole lot cheaper. The next two questions are about trade and China, and I think Paul has already addressed that. So let me move on to one posed by Glenna Matthews, and I think it's directed mainly at Anna Minian. Glenna writes, what percentage of the border crossers immediately ask for asylum? How does that affect policy?
So increasingly, actually, the border fortification plans are not effective, because if we look at who is coming into the country, there are people who are asking for asylums. Since the recession of 2008, more Mexicans who were traditionally economic migrants, so economic refugees who are not considered refugees or asylum seekers. Since 2008, Mexican migration has seen more people leave the country. More Mexicans are leaving the United States than coming in. And the people who are trying to enter the country are Central Americans who could be considered refugees or asylum seekers. So they are increasingly a larger proportion of them. What was the second part of the question, John? Sorry.
Oops, sorry, I've been scrolling ahead looking for the next questions. The second one is, how does this affect, second part, how does that affect policy?
So Biden has said that he will increase the number of refugees that the United States will take. And he has also said that he will take away this remain in Mexico policy. Now, what's really important when it comes to these issues is that the whole category of what constitutes a refugee was created under Cold War paradigms right after the Second World War. And it is very hard to prove that you deserve asylum because it's based on individual restrictions, so showing that you individually are being discriminated against based on certain categories. And of course, people are often targeted as parts of groups. And so it is very hard to show. And Biden is not trying to revert, neither Biden nor anyone else at the moment, to revert the whole categorization of how we define refugees and asylum seekers. So for example, if you are fleeing because of environmental devastation as a climate refugee, you're still officially not considered a refugee under the category of what a refugee means at the moment.
So a couple of questions that I think fall in Beverly's basket concerning foreign policy. I'm going to lump these together, Beverly, and you see what you can do with them. First one comes from Ellen Baker, and it says, do you think our allies are going to go along with option 2 that you laid out? Are our allies going to go along with simply restoring the previous system? And then, that's from Ellen Baker. Meredith Wheeler writes, what role will Brexit play in the relations between the USA and the UK versus EU? Will the USA pivot more toward the EU?
Well, I think it's right to combine those in some sense because despite the direction that the Obama administration, as I said, seems to want to be going, which is a sort of restorationist direction, at least as far as we can tell from these initial appointments. Of course, there are many, many other actors in this, in the process of creating foreign policy, and particularly in how it plays out on the ground. And so I think one of the great open questions of the moment is whether traditional allies, so I think implicitly both of these questions, explicitly in one case and implicitly in the other, we're talking about European allies, but whether various nation states, allies, and adversaries around the world are going to adopt a narrative that Trump was an anomaly, right? That the kind of not who we really are story, or whether this has been a kind of fundamental undermining of anything that looks like US leadership. And I would say particularly around questions of democracy promotion, right? Around questions of maybe even leadership more broadly. Now, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I think there's a real argument to be made that this might in fact be a good thing, that forcing the US into a position where even if it's engaging in something that you might have described at one point as democracy promotion, is approaching it not from a position of, look at us, we do everything right, and you've got to do that, but maybe from a more humble position of, okay, it looks like democracy is pretty fragile, right? It looks like we've had our own set of experiences with precisely what we just saw. So at any rate, the short answer is that I think we don't actually know right now. I think if I had to predict that in fact most countries in the world are not going to want to return institutionally or reputationally to what we had before. And the Brexit question is particularly interesting because it has, and maybe Professor Krugman wants to talk about that a little bit too, because it has, you know, a set of practical implications. But in many ways, to me, the most interesting alliance question there is not between the US government and the British government, but will be between kind of pro-Brexit, anti-liberal forces on the ground in Britain. And what we see here, we don't tend to talk about a lot of that in international terms or in terms of something that we might call alliances. But of course, all of these movements are watching each other, talking to each other, etc. And I think in many ways, even post-Trump, as much as people want to say, aha, certain things have been set aside, you have millions of people in the United States and around the world who see the rise of a Biden administration actually as something of a tragedy.
My Scottish relatives say that the United Kingdom will soon be Little England. Tom Spencer poses a question that I think might relate to all panelists. Tom writes, if post-Trump, the US can no longer impose its will on the international order, can it yet initiate change in that order on trade, human rights, and greenhouse emissions as a first among equals? That is, do the Magnitsky Acts offer a precedent, namely numerous countries led by the US simultaneously enacting very similar domestic measures to effect an international consensus? Paul, any remarks?
So I would say that so I think the United States hasn't had the ability to impose its will for quite a while in most domains. I mean, we did have we were uniquely powerful in a military sense, but that's not actually very useful most of the time. And on trade, we've really been co-equal with the European Union for quite a while, comparable size in terms of weight in the world trading system, comparable importance in setting the rules. And what I would say is that, so it was already the case that the United States had a leadership role, mainly in the sense that we needed to be, we could sometimes initiate stuff, but I think more important, it was kind of important that we be part of whatever was going on. And I guess if I'm feeling optimistic, which is, it depends a lot on which day of the week it is right now. I would say that the United States, by being a part, the United States, by signing on to international cooperation on good stuff, can still play an important role. In the case of climate, John, you've been talking about that much more than I have, which is not at all. But I think in the case of climate, at least up to a point, in a way, the United States has been the brake on international climate action, and simply the United States changing position and being willing to say, no, we're for it too, and here's our ideas, and here's what we're willing to do, gets a lot of stuff happening. So we don't have to be able to impose our will on the world. We simply have to be part of the process. And I think to some extent, and to the extent that we can reconstitute the global trading system, it's the same thing. Maybe pandemic preparedness is the same thing as well. So we don't have to dominate the world. We just have to play our role to make a big change from where we are right now.
Yeah, I'd say quickly with respect to greenhouse emissions, the US is not first among equals anymore.
That's right.
But
may I just add that on all of these things, I mean, one of the US-China, the China question, not US-China, the China question, it is going to be critical. So on greenhouse gas emissions, China is critical. On world trade, the Chinese economy is now on a purchasing power basis bigger than ours, and pretty soon on a market value basis will be bigger than ours. So actually, in many ways, the question is how does the United States help to get China into the role of being a good citizen, or at least a not too bad citizen on global issues?
yeah, well, this, in my view, goes back to the question of the US-China relationship not being so bad as to prevent cooperation on all these multilateral issues.
Yeah, we can't bully China. We can make it costly for them to do bad stuff, but only at the cost for ourselves. So the United States needs to figure out a way to, try to figure out a way to have a constructive, if not exactly friendly, relationship with China.
Okay, let me turn to another question. This might have to be the last one as our allotted time is about to expire. I'm choosing this one almost at random. John Charterina from the University of the Basque Country in Spain asks, taking Francis Fukuyama's think, do you think the Biden administration will be capable of restoring America's eroded legitimate power for democracy? Thank you. Beverly, why don't you have the first crack at that?
Well, I think it's certainly one of the stated intentions of the Obama administration to do something quite like that. There has been talk of a summit of democracies. There's been certainly very self-conscious talk about the need to restore the legitimacy of American democracy in order to even begin to talk about all of this on the world stage as well. So I would say that it is certainly going to be a part of American rhetoric moving forward. And I think actually, you know, one thing that the Obama administration has done, which is simply the fact of putting, you know, experienced, intelligent, responsible people into positions of power, simply filling positions within the American diplomatic corps, within the Foreign Service, the State Department, which certainly they're going to set out to do, is going to make at least some difference in a kind of practical sense on the ground about how all of this plays out. The short answer is, I think it is a stated intention and a big ambition of the Biden administration to do precisely what the questioner is suggesting. I think there are also some dangers in settling into a framework which is about a struggle between democracy and authoritarian regimes. You know, one thing that we've seen over the past several years is that it's not always so clear where any given nation stands, and that sort of binary framework, I think, comes with dangers, right? To go back to our kind of Cold War metaphors, it comes with dangers of its own, and it can actually foreclose certain actions, certain negotiations around things, precisely as you're talking about, like climate, like public health, if taken to some sort of extreme.
Okay. We're about to close. It's been quite a week for everybody, but I want to end on an optimistic note. Joe Peskoff asks, Dr. McNeill, aren't you at all optimistic that a Biden administration coupled with a Democratic-held Congress will act to increase solar, wind, and other alternative energy sources, as well as electric vehicles, that will make a dent in US emissions? The answer, Joel Peskoff, is yes, I am optimistic. I'm confident, actually, that the administration will act and will succeed to a considerable degree in changing the emissions profile of the United States in the years to come. So that's my note of cheer for the afternoon. I hope that you all have a cheerful weekend. I want to thank our panelists, Beverly, Gage, Paul Krugman, and Minian, for sharing their wisdom with us this afternoon. And I think Debbie Doyle from the AHA will make a remark or two to close out the session. Debbie?
Yes, that concludes our session for today. A recording will be available on our YouTube channel in a week or two. And you can also find recordings of other virtual AHA events on our YouTube channel. I'd like to extend thanks to our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to all who submitted questions. We apologize for not getting to everything during the limited time we had. And finally, a special thanks to our panelists today for a fascinating conversation. Have a good day. Thank you.